A Terribly Strange Bed was written in 1852. This BBC radio production is read by Paul Daneman and was first broadcast in 1989.
Shortly after my education at college was finished, I happened to be staying in Paris with an English friend. We were both young men then and lived, I'm afraid, rather a wild life in the delightful city of our sojourn. One night, we were idling about the neighbourhood of the Palais Royal, doubtful to what amusement we should next betake ourselves. My friend proposed a visit to Frascati's gambling house, but his suggestion was not to my taste. "For heaven's sake," said I to my friend, "let us go somewhere where we can see a little genuine, blackguard, poverty-stricken gaming, with no false gingerbread glitter thrown over it all. Let us get away from fashionable Frascati's to a house where they don't mind letting in a man with a ragged coat, or a man with no coat, ragged or otherwise." "Very well," said my friend. "Here's the place, just before us, as blackguard a place by all report as you could possibly wish to see." In another minute we arrived at the door and entered the house. When we got upstairs and had left our hats and sticks with the doorkeeper, we were admitted into the chief gambling room. We did not find many people assembled there, but, few as the men were who looked up at us on our entrance, they were all types, lamentably true types, of their respective classes. We had come to see blackguards, but these men were something worse. There is a comic side, more or less appreciable, in all blackguardism. Here there was nothing but tragedy, mute, weird tragedy. The quiet in the room was horrible. The thin, haggard, long-haired young man whose sunken eyes fiercely watched the turning up of the cards never spoke. The flabby, fat-faced, pimply player who pricked his piece of pasteboard perseveringly to register how often black won and how often red never spoke. The dirty, wrinkled old man with the vulture eyes and the darned greatcoat, who had lost his last sou and still looked on desperately after he could play no longer, never spoke. Even the voice of the croupier sounded as if it were strangely dulled and thickened in the atmosphere of the room. I had entered the place to laugh, but the spectacle before me was something to weep over. I soon found it necessary to take refuge in excitement by going to the table and beginning to play. Still more, unfortunately, as the event will show, I won. Won prodigiously, won incredibly. Won at such a rate that the regular players at the table crowded round me, and staring at my stakes with hungry, superstitious eyes, whispered to one another that the English stranger was going to break the bank. The game was rouge et noir. My success first bewildered me, and this, in the most literal meaning of the word, intoxicated me. Time after time I staked higher and higher, and still won. The excitement in the room rose to fever pitch. The silence was interrupted by a deep muttered chorus of oaths and exclamations in different languages every time the gold was shovelled across to my side of the table. Even the imperturbable croupier dashed his rake on the floor in a fury of astonishment at my success. My friend begged me to leave the place, satisfied with what I had already gained, and indeed repeated his entreaties several times, and only left me after I had rejected his advice. Shortly after he had gone, a hoarse voice behind me cried,
"Permit me, my dear sir, permit me to restore to their proper place two Napoleons which you have dropped. Wonderful luck, sir. I pledge you my word of honour, as an old soldier, in the course of my long experience in this sort of thing, I never saw such luck as yours. Never. Go on, sir. Go on boldly and break the bank."
I turned round and saw a tall man dressed in a frogged and braided surtout. If I had been in my senses, I should have considered him rather a suspicious specimen of an old soldier. He had goggling, bloodshot eyes and a broken nose, but in my excitement I was ready to fraternize with anybody. And I did go on, went on at such a rate that in another quarter of an hour the croupier called out, "Gentlemen, the bank has discontinued for tonight." All the notes, and all the gold in that bank now lay in the heap under my hands.
"Tie up your money in your pocket handkerchief, my worthy sir,"
said the old soldier, as I wildly plunged my hands into the heap of gold.
There, that's it. Shovel 'em in. Notes and all. And now, as an ancient grenadier, as an ex-brave of the French army, what remains for me to do? Simply this, to entreat my valued English friend to drink a bottle of champagne with me, and toast the goddess Fortune in foaming goblets before we part.
By the time the second bottle of champagne was emptied, I felt as if I had been drinking liquid fire. My brain seemed all aflame. No excess in wine had ever had this effect on me before in my life. Was it the result of a stimulant acting upon my system when I was in a highly excited state? Or was the champagne amazingly strong? "Ex-brave of the French army!" cried I in a state of mad exhilaration. "I am on fire! Let us have a third bottle of champagne to put the flame out!" The old soldier wagged his head, rolled his goggle eyes, until I expected to see them slip out of their sockets, placed his dirty forefinger by the side of his broken nose, and called to the mistress of the house for coffee. The coffee came in, ready poured out in 2 cups. I was parched with thirst, and drank it off at a draught. Almost instantly afterward, I was seized with a fit of giddiness. The room whirled round and round furiously. The old soldier seemed to be regularly bobbing up and down before me like the pistons of a steam engine.
"My dear friend,"
said the old soldier, and even his voice seemed to be bobbing up and down as he spoke.
"My dear friend, it would be madness to go home in your state. You might be robbed and murdered with the greatest ease. I am going to sleep here. They make capital beds in this house. Take one, sleep off the effects of the wine, and go home safely with your winnings tomorrow in broad daylight." I had but 2 ideas left. One, that I must never let go of my handkerchief full of money. The other, that I must lie down somewhere immediately. So I agreed to the proposal about the bed, and took the offered arm of the old soldier. Preceded by the croupier, we passed along some passages and up a flight of stairs into the bedroom which I was to occupy. The ex-brave shook me warmly by the hand, proposed that we should breakfast together, and then left me for the night. I ran to the washhand stand, drank some of the water in my jug, poured the rest out, and plunged my face into it, and then sat down in a chair and tried to compose myself. My first thought was of the risk of sleeping all night in a gambling house. My second of the still greater risk of trying to get out after the house was closed, and of going home alone at night through the streets of Paris with a large sum of money about me. I had slept in worse places than this on my travels. So I determined to lock, bolt, and barricade my door, and take my chance till the next morning. Accordingly, I secured myself against all intrusion, and got into bed, with the handkerchief full of money under my pillow. I soon felt not only that I could not go to sleep, but that I could not even close my eyes. I was wide awake, and in a high fever. I groaned with vexation as I felt that I was in for a sleepless night. But what could I do? I had no book to read, and yet, unless I found out some method of diverting my mind, I felt certain that I was in the condition to imagine all sorts of horrors. In short, to pass the night in suffering all conceivable varieties of nervous terror. I raised myself on my elbow and looked about the room, which was brightened by a lovely moonlight pouring straight through the window, to see if it contained any pictures or ornaments that I could at all clearly distinguish. There was first the bed I was lying in, a 4-post bed with a regular top lined with chintz, the regular fringed valance all round, the regular stifling, unwholesome curtains, which I remembered having mechanically drawn back against the posts without particularly noticing the bed when I first got into the room. The feeble candle dimly showed me one dark old picture of a fellow in a high Spanish hat crowned with a plume of towering feathers, a swarthy, sinister ruffian looking upward, shading his eyes with his hand, and looking intently upward. It might be at some tall gallows at which he was going to be hanged. At any rate, he had the appearance of thoroughly deserving it. This picture put a kind of constraint upon me to look upward, too, at the top of the bed. It was a gloomy and not an interesting object, and I looked back at the picture. I counted the feathers in the man's hat, 3 white, 2 green.
my thoughts insensibly began to wander. The moonlight shining into the room reminded me of a certain moonlight night in England, the night after a picnic party in a Welsh valley. I called to mind the sentimental young lady who would quote Childe Harold because it was moonlight. I was absorbed by these past scenes and past amusements when, in an instant, the thread on which my memories hung snapped asunder. My attention immediately came back to present things more vividly than ever, and I found myself looking hard at the picture again. Looking for what? Good God! The man had pulled his hat down on his brows. No, the hat itself was gone. Where was the conical crown? Where the feathers? 3 white, 2 green. Not there. In place of the hat and feathers, what dusky object was it that now hid his forehead, his eyes, his shading hand? Was the bed moving? I turned on my back and looked up. Was I mad? Drunk? Dreaming? Giddy again? Or was the top of the bed really moving down, sinking slowly, regularly, silently, horribly, right down throughout the whole of its length and breadth, right down upon me as I lay underneath? My blood seemed to stand still. A deadly, paralyzing coldness stole all over me as I turned my head round on the pillow and determined to test whether the bed top was really moving or not by keeping my eye on the man in the picture. The next look in that direction was enough. The dull, black, frowsy outline of the valance above me was within an inch of being parallel with his waist, and steadily and slowly, very slowly, I saw the figure and the line of frame below the figure vanish as the valance moved down before it. I looked up shuddering, helpless beneath the hideous machinery for murder, which was advancing closer and closer to suffocate me where I lay. Down and down, without pausing and without sounding, came the bed top, and still my panic terror seemed to bind me faster and faster to the mattress on which I lay. Down and down it sank, till the dusty odour from the lining of the canopy came stealing into my nostrils. At that final moment, the instinct of self-preservation startled me out of my trance, and I moved at last. There was just room for me to roll myself sideways off the bed. As I dropped noiselessly to the floor, the edge of the murderer's canopy touched me on the shoulder. Without stopping to draw my breath and without wiping the cold sweat from my face, I rose instantly on my knees to watch the bed top. It descended. The whole canopy, with the fringe round it, came down, down, so close that there was not room now to squeeze my finger between the bed top and the bed. I felt at the sides and discovered that what appeared to me from beneath to be an ordinary light canopy of a 4-post bed was in reality a thick, broad mattress, the substance of which was concealed by the valance and its fringe. I looked up and saw the 4 posts rising hideously bare. In the middle of the bed top was a huge wooden screw that had evidently worked it down through a hole in the ceiling, just as ordinary presses are worked down on the substance selected for compression. The frightful apparatus moved without making the faintest noise. Still, as I looked on it, I could not move, I could hardly breathe. But I began to recover the power of thinking, and in a moment I discovered the murderous conspiracy framed against me in all its horror. My cup of coffee had been drugged, and drugged too strongly. I had been saved from being smothered by having taken an overdose of some narcotic. How I had chafed and fretted at the fever fit which had preserved my life by keeping me awake. How recklessly I had confided myself to the 2 wretches who had led me into this room, determined for the sake of my winnings to kill me in my sleep by the surest and most horrible contrivance for secretly accomplishing my destruction. How many men, winners like me, had slept as I had proposed to sleep, in that bed, and had never been seen or heard of more. I shuddered at the bare idea of it. But ere long, all thought was again suspended by the sight of the murderer's canopy moving once more. After it had remained on the bed, as nearly as I could guess about 10 minutes, it began to move up again. The villains who worked it from above evidently believed that their purpose was now accomplished, Slowly and silently, as it had descended, that horrible bed-top rose towards the ceiling. Neither hole nor screw could be seen. The bed became in appearance an ordinary bed again, the canopy an ordinary canopy, even to the most suspicious eyes. I rose from my knees and considered how I should escape. I had moved a wooden chest against the door, and to remove it, my blood ran cold as I thought what its contents might be, without making some noise, was impossible. Only one chance was left to me: the window. My bedroom was on the first floor, above an entresol, and looked down into a back street. I raised my hand to open the window, knowing that on that action hung, by the merest hairbreadth, my chance of safety. They keep vigilant watch in a house of murder. If any part of the frame cracked, if the hinge creaked, I was a lost man. I succeeded in doing it silently, in doing it with all the dexterity of a housebreaker, and then looked down into the street. Down the left side of the house ran a thick water pipe. It passed close by the outer edge of the window. The moment I saw the pipe, I knew I was saved. I had already got one leg over the windowsill when I remembered the handkerchief filled with money. I was revengefully determined that the miscreants should miss their money as well as their victim. So I went back and tied the heavy handkerchief at my back by my cravat. I slid down into the street easily and quietly, and immediately set off at the top of my speed to a branch prefecture of police, which I knew was situated in the immediate neighbourhood. A sub-prefect and several picked men among his subordinates happened to be up, maturing, I believe, some scheme for discovering the perpetrator of a mysterious murder which all Paris was talking of just then. When I began my story, in a breathless hurry and in very bad French, I could see that the sub-prefect suspected me of being a drunken Englishman who had robbed somebody. But he soon altered his opinion as I went on, and before I had anything like concluded, he shoved all the papers before him into a drawer, put on his hat, ordered a file of soldiers, and took my arm in the most friendly and familiar manner possible to lead me with him out of the house. I will venture to say that when the sub-prefect was a little boy and was taken for the first time to the play, he was not half as much pleased as he was now at the job in prospect for him at the gambling house. Sentinels were placed at the back and front of the house the moment we got to it. A tremendous battery of knocks was directed against the door. A light appeared at the window. I was told to conceal myself behind the police. Then came more knocks and a cry of, "Open in the name of the law!" At that terrible summons, bolts and locks gave way, and the moment after the sub-prefect was in the passage, confronting a waiter, half-dressed and ghastly pale. This was the short dialogue which immediately took place. "We want to see the Englishman who is sleeping in this house."
He went away hours ago.
"He did no such thing. His friend went away. He remained. Show us to his bedroom."
I swear to you, monsieur le sous-prefect, he is not here.
"I swear to you, monsieur le garçon, he is. He slept here. He didn't find your bed comfortable. He came to us to complain of it. Here he is, among my men, and here am I, ready to look for a flea or two in his bedstead. Renard," calling to one of his subordinates, and pointing to the waiter, "collar that man and tie his hands behind him. Now then, gentlemen, let us walk upstairs." Every man and woman in the house was secured, the old soldier the first. I identified the bed in which I had slept, and then we went into the room above. No object that was at all extraordinary appeared in any part of it. The sub-prefect looked round the place, stamped twice on the floor, called for a candle, looked attentively at the spot he stamped on, and ordered the flooring there to be carefully taken up. Lights were produced, and we saw a deep raftered cavity between the floor of this room and the ceiling of the room beneath. Through this cavity there ran, perpendicularly, a sort of case of iron thickly greased, and inside the case appeared the screw, which communicated with the bed-top below. Extra lengths of screw, freshly oiled, levers covered with felt, all the complete upper works of a heavy press, constructed with infernal ingenuity so as to join the fixtures below, were next discovered and pulled out on the floor. After some little difficulty, the sub-prefect succeeded in putting the machinery together, and leaving his men to work it, descended with me to the bedroom. The smothering canopy was then lowered, but not so noiselessly as I had seen it lowered. When I mentioned this to the sub-prefect, his answer, simple as it was, had a terrible significance. "My men," said he, "are working down the bed top for the first time. The men whose money you won were in better practice." We left the house in the sole possession of 2 police agents, every one of the inmates being removed to prison on the spot. The sub-prefect returned with me to my hotel to get my passport. "Do you think," I asked, "that any men have really been smothered in that bed, as they tried to smother me?" "I've seen dozens of drowned men laid out at the morgue," answered the sub-prefect, "in whose pocketbooks were found letters stating that they had committed suicide in the Seine because they had lost everything at the gambling table. Do I know how many of those men entered the same gambling house that you entered, won as you won, took that bed as you took it, slept in it, were smothered in it, and were privately thrown into the river with a letter of explanation written by the murderers and placed in their pocketbooks? The people of the gambling house kept their bedstead machinery a secret from us, even from the police. The dead kept the rest of the secret for them. Good night, or rather, good morning, Monsieur Faulkner." The rest of my story is soon told. I discovered that the old soldier was the master of the gambling house. Justice discovered that he had been drummed out of the army as a vagabond years ago, that he had been guilty of all sorts of villainies since, that he was in possession of stolen property, which the owners identified, and that he, the croupier, another accomplice, and the woman who had made my cup of coffee were all in the secret of the bedstead. The old soldier and his 2 head myrmidons, they went to the galleys. The woman who had drugged my coffee was imprisoned for I forget how many years. The regular attendants at the gambling house were considered suspicious and placed under surveillance. And I became, for 1 whole week, the head lion in Parisian society. My adventure was dramatised by 3 illustrious playmakers, but never saw theatrical daylight, for the censorship forbade the introduction on the stage of a correct copy of the gambling house bedstead. One good result was produced by my adventure, which any censorship must have approved. It cured me of ever gambling as an amusement. The sight of a green cloth, with packs of cards and heaps of money on it, will henceforth be forever associated in my mind with the sight of a bed canopy descending to suffocate me in the silence and darkness of the night.
A Terribly Strange Bed by Wilkie Collins was adapted by Michael Bakewell. It was read by Paul Daneman and produced by Rosemary Hart.